Welcome back to Old School Sports and our OOTP 23 playthrough of the Pittsburgh Pirates. We are about to begin the 2043 playoffs. The Pirates, for the third consecutive season and the fourth time in our 6 years as general manager, are a playoff team. And we did it with a 97-65 record, which is the best that the Pirates have been over our 6 years in charge. So that is the good news. The bad news is that we still are struggling to overcome the high-powered St. Louis Cardinals in the National League Central. For those four playoff appearances, we just have one division title back in 94 and 68. We've been a wild card team, second in the NL Central each of the past 3 seasons. And for the third season in a row, we are going to be facing the New York Mets in the playoffs. Back in 2041, we were tied with them for the first and second wild card spots. We were 3-3 against them in the regular season. They had home field advantage in the series, and they took us out in the wild card round 2-0. Last year, even though we had the worst record that we've had in any of our four playoff seasons, we did make it all the way to the National League Championship Series, finally not just winning a playoff game, but winning a wild card series and an NLDS. But in that NLCS, we fell 4-1 to the eventual World Series champion New York Mets. So over the last 2 seasons, they've taken us out of the playoffs both times, and they have a combined 6-1 record against us. So we're hoping we can get some revenge this season. Unfortunately, that 3-game series is going to be on the road in New York. We have set up our pitching staff so that our top 3 pitchers, the youngster Luis Longoria, Tony Santana, the one pitcher that we've spent big money on despite being a low-budget team, and the veteran Bobby Gonzalez are set to go if we go to 3 games. We'll see what happens. The Mets are the one team in the National League that has consistently had a better pitching staff than the Pirates over the past few years. This season, we've got the number 2 team in runs allowed in the National League, but we're going to be going up against the number 1 team in runs allowed with the Mets when this wild card series begins tomorrow. And taking a look at our playoff roster, perhaps one surprise as far as the pitchers, Tony Jones, who was up all year, veteran right-hander, 3-2, 2 saves, and a 3.70 ERA with 111 strikeouts over 109 and a third innings pitched, was the odd man out when we tried to go from the 28-man September roster with 13 pitchers to the 12 pitchers that we want to carry in the playoffs. So Jones, despite being up all year and having a pretty respectable season out of the bullpen, did not make the team. Ricky Rios, who recently came back from an injury, had a 3.08 ERA over 61 and a third innings pitched. And we decided to go with the 26-year-old Rios over Mr. Jones for the final spot in our bullpen. Nick Jarmone, who was 6-5 with a 3.62 ERA and 95 strikeouts and 79 and 2/3 innings, was also kind of in the mix to be a guy who didn't make the 26-man playoff roster. The fact that we're making those kind of decisions kind of shows you how good our pitching has been this season and hopefully will be in the playoffs. And then a bit of a surprise with one player who did make the 26-man roster. The youngster, Ethan Fox, only up for the month of September and actually only got 14 at-bats, during which he had 4 hits. Only has 23 days of Major League service at this point since his September 1st call-up. One of the players that we picked up in that big trade with the Angels about a year and a half ago, traded away one of the top prospects in baseball for Ethan Fox. as well as a big young starter for us. Fox makes the team despite his lack of major league experience because his defensive versatility and his potential defensive quality. Very good potential defensive third baseman or first baseman. He's also a respectable outfielder. He can play second or second or short if we really needed him to. Not that that's the hope. But it came down to Ethan Fox, last year's National League Rookie of the Year, Sean Barley, who hit just 184, a buck 84 for us and 147 at bats. Ended up spending a good chunk of the season in AAA. He's just not that good of a defensive player, even if I could make an argument that his bat may be a bit better than Fox's. Similarly, Andres Mendez, who was up all year, although he only had 83 at-bats. Nice left-handed bat potentially coming off the bench, but just doesn't offer much defensively. So because of Mendez and Barley's defensive limitations and the fact that their bats are not obviously superior to Ethan Fox's, Ethan Fox's defensive versatility gets him to join the playoff roster along with the man that he was traded to us with, Jose Montoya, number 81 prospect in baseball, went 7-5 with a 4.08 ERA for our team this year. He was our fourth starter most of the year. Right now he's in the bullpen for this series, but quite honestly, it's going to be a 3-game series at most, so the fourth starter doesn't really matter. And we'd honestly rather potentially have Montoya pitching out of the pen over the next few days than Omar Gaona, who was our number 5 starter for most of the second half of the year. And the Mets, as you can see, were 1 game better than us this year at 98-64, even though we did take the season series. As I mentioned, they are the number 1 pitching staff in the NL, the number 1 pitching staff in baseball, but we are not too far behind. And our offense this year was materially better than the Mets. We outscored them by almost half a run a game. So can make an argument that it's finally our time to break through against that vaunted Mets pitching staff. But the fact that they've got home field advantage certainly plays in their favor. We have the brilliant youngster Luis Longoria on the mound. You can see his stuff and his movement are off the charts. 3 excellent to brilliant pitches. His control is not necessarily the best in the world, but he has been an incredibly effective pitcher over his first 3 seasons in the majors. 14-6 this year with 246 strikeouts in 170 innings. He is fragile. Kind of getting him through these seasons is the big thing that we really need to focus on. So we've kept him on a 90 pitch count throughout the regular season. Now that we're in the playoffs, we'll bump that up a little bit to 100, see what we can get out of him. But we've got one of our co-aces on the mound for the Mets, Willis Cabello, 31-year-old, 10-13 record with a 4.01 ERA. Also a fragile pitcher, local guy from Elmont, New York for the New York Mets. We're going to have to win 2 games, not just 1 game in New York if we're going to win this series. But certainly this pitching matchup with Luis Longoria on the mound in the first game feels like one that we're going to have to get if we've got any chance of finally overcoming the dragon that is the Mets and slaying them to move on to an NLDS matchup. And we did get a 4-1 win in Game 1. So it looks like we got the performance from Longoria that we needed. Take a look at the box score. We jumped out with 2 runs in the first, added 2 more in the fourth. They finally got a run on us in the 6th, but held that Mets offense to 3 runs. or to 3 hits, 1 run on 3 hits. The Pirates 4 runs on 12 hits. Longoria 1 run over 6 1/3 innings, did walk 4 but struck out 8. Got clean relief from Montoya. Collazo came on for the save, so good to see the youngster Montoya joining the other youngster Longoria. Pitching really well for us was Montoya's playoff debut. Obviously, Longoria has been in the playoffs with us the past couple years at this point. So things are good there. Henry Gonzalez, the potential rookie of the year, looks like he had a really nice game. 3 for 5 with a double, 1 run scored, 2 runs driven in. Luis Flores, recently back from the IL, also drove in a run. Second baseman Juan Rivera, catcher Nelson Ibarra, and shortstop Tony Cota scoring the other runs for us. But good start to the series for the Pirates. Let's see if we can finally get past these New York Mets. Moving on to Game 2, and our co-ace, along with Mr. Longoria, Tony Santana on the mound. He is a player who we are paying big money to now. We had both him and Ricky Gotti as young pitchers who we really liked when we took this team over 6 years ago. We decided to make the long-term commitment to Tony Santana. You can see he made $14 million this year, $16 next year, $18 the year after, and then a team option for $20 million. Because of the big commitment we made to Santana, and the fact that we are still one of the smallest budget teams in all of baseball, we had to move on from Mr. Gotti before this season. But our faith in Mr. Santana seems to have been well placed. 20-win season, very rare in this day and age in baseball. Led the National League, 20-2 record, 2.78 ERA, and 229 strikeouts and 187 2/3 innings. Put up a 5 WAR and a 2.65 Sierra. We did skip over Santana in game 162 when there was still a chance that we could potentially catch the Mets and get home field advantage in the playoffs. As it turned out, we lost 1-0, and the Mets also lost that day, so that's why we are on the road. But we kind of saved Santana for this spot rather than pitching him a few days ago in the final game of the season to potentially get the series to be at home. We felt that we were kind of a long shot to do that. Went with a pitcher who obviously pitched well for us, even though we lost 1-0. But now we've got Santana here. This is exactly what we set him up for. See if we can win Game 2 and get past the Mets. He's going to be going against Jose Diaz, 7-10 record, 3.93 ERA over 171 2/3 innings pitched. So it actually almost seems like, despite the fact that the Mets had the best pitching staff in baseball this past year, I'd say that the pitching matchups, you could argue, favor us in both games 1 and 2 of this series. I don't know if in their effort to hold us off and get the home field advantage, they were pitching all of their top pitchers right through game 162. Very well, maybe what happened. And if we are able to get the win today, we'll definitely feel that our strategy paid off. But it is not to be. We're going to a deciding Game 3. Mets beat us easily 6-2. You can see that they had 4 home runs, Nin, Meneses with a couple, and Santana. We did get home runs from Alfredo Velasquez and Isaiah Hill, but clearly the Mets outpitched us, and now we may be in a situation where the pitching matchup favors them significantly. Tony Santana, 3 earned runs over 4 innings. Calvin, who's the guy who came in and pitched that really nice game for us in game 162, even though we lost 1-0, gave up a couple of runs over 1 2/3 innings, and then Tolka even gave up a run. So just not the best pitching performance on the mound by the Pirates overall today. Mets bounced back. They're the defending champions. It's going to be hard to take them out. You can see they just strung together runs in 5 consecutive innings in the middle of the game to kind of put things away. Not a lot of offense for the Pirates today, just 5 hits, runs batted in from Hill and Velasquez with those home runs that we talked about earlier. That accounted for both of the runs. And now it's going to get interesting. Because theoretically, it says that Omar Gaona, who has been our number 5 starter for most of this season, is potentially going to be going in the critical Game 3 tomorrow. Although Bobby Gonzalez should be fully rested by then, so I think they may switch that on us. Let's sim ahead a day, and I believe Gonzalez should now be slotting in as our pitcher for this deciding Game 3 against the New York Mets. Obviously, after such a good regular season, the hope is that we can keep this year going, but we're up against it now with a team that's taken us out 2 consecutive years, and yeah, it looks like Gonzalez is going to go for us, so I think that's a small step in the right direction to have the veteran on the mound instead of Omar Gaona, although Omar is a veteran at this point too, but not as proven as a starting pitcher, particularly in the playoffs, as Mr. Gonzalez has been. Gonzalez, 10-8 this year, 4.09 ERA, 181 strikeouts and 180 in a third innings, put up a 2.5 WAR. Pretty typical Bobby Gonzalez season. He's an Iron Man. He's out there every day. He's a guy that we brought on board after our first season in Pittsburgh, and he's been an important member of our rotation ever since then. Going to be going up against Jose Cardoza, and now we're getting into some of the stronger pitchers for the Mets. 14-6 record with a 3.50 ERA, over 174 and 2/3 innings pitched. Similar to Gonzalez, he's an Iron Man, and he hit a 240. Oh, he had the 242 BABIP while with the Mets this year, which led the league. You can see he came over in a April 10th trade with the Dodgers. Kind of interesting timing for a trade of a pretty well-established and solid pitcher to take place. It looks like a pretty even pitching matchup. I'd say you're going to probably have to give the Mets the advantage because they are the home team, but Cardoza is not overwhelming. I'm actually going to take a look at the Mets because we've got in Diaz, Cabello, and Cardoza, but they honestly are not as intimidating as some of the pitchers that I felt like we played against with the Mets last season. And they're down to a 3-man rotation, which makes sense. We probably should have done the same thing. I never really thought about that for a wild card series, but it does make sense. But they must have somebody who ended up getting hurt. There we go. Tristan Champion. That could work in our favor. He is obviously an excellent pitcher and someone who we've faced each of the last couple years. 14-12 record, led the National League in innings pitched, whip, walks per 9, strikeout to walk ratio, and pitcher WAR. But he suffered a strained forearm towards the end of the year. So the fact that we haven't had to face Tristan Champion, certainly a point in our favor. Be interesting to see if the Mets get by us, whether or not they're able to repeat without Champion on the mound. But I don't hate the pitching matchup for us today. As I said, I think you've got to favor the Mets because it's a pretty even pitching matchup and they're at home. But maybe there's finally a little bit of magic for these Pirates in Citi Field. And there is. We have finally gotten by the New York Mets in the playoffs. And the rookie, Henry Gonzalez, Series MVP, to potentially add to a possible Rookie of the Year award. Collazo got the win in relief. Nance with the loss in relief. Let's take a look at the box score and see what happened. We jumped out to a 1-0 lead. They tied us. They took a 2-1 lead into the 9th inning. We scored a run in the 9th to tie it up, and then 2 in the 10th to get the victory. And in the 10th, a 2-run homer from third baseman Jaden Dixon to give us the victory. Also got 2 runs driven in by Luis Flores, so the young first baseman drove in the runs in the first and the 9th innings for us. So big win for the Pirates. Gonzalez was very solid. 1 earned run, 2 hits, and 3 walks over 5 1/3. Emptied out the bullpen with Tolka, Gaylord, Calvin, and then eventually Collazo, who pitched the final 2 innings to get the victory. So after 2 consecutive years of frustration against the New York Mets in the playoffs, the Pirates have gotten past the Mets and are into the NLDS. And as we prepare to face the NL East champion Atlanta Braves in the NLDS, checked in with manager Jan Vasquez, and he wants to go with the veteran Omar Gaona, who was our number 5 starter for most of this season, rather than the youngster Jose Montoya, who came up and was our number 4 starter for most of this year. I am going to defer to the manager. We just re-signed him to a large contract extension, so he'll be back with us for another 5 years. Gaona certainly had a really nice season. We've used him as a reliever mostly over the past several years when he's been with our team. Some years he didn't pitch a ton of innings as a lefty specialist out of the pen. Certainly you look at his stuff, his movement and his control, and he kind of looks like one of the worst pitchers on our team. He certainly isn't good as Montoya in any of those things. Although to be fair, Montoya's numbers are boosted a little bit right now because he's in a relief role rather than a starting role. But it's going to show a lot of faith in our manager to let our number 5 starter pitch game 1 in Atlanta as we're trying to move on to a 2nd consecutive National League Championship Series. Taking a look at the playoff tree in general, the Angels going up against the Rangers, so a AL West battle there. And the Yankees facing off against our former team, the Royals, who are still pretty competitive. Feel like we built a pretty good farm system for them. It's been 6 years now since we left, and they are still a pretty solid team. We're going to get to go up against Atlanta. And then the Padres facing the Cardinals, who beat us in the NL Central. So we've talked a lot about Omar Gaona. 11-9 record, ended up as our number 5 starter the entire season. I think I messed up before and said we had moved him into the bullpen during this year, but that obviously wasn't accurate. I must have been thinking back to last season when he ended up starting 13 games for us. So he was part of the rotation all year long. You can see he profiles as a average-ish major league starter, even though he was definitely better than average this year in terms of his ERA plus and his FIP minus. His Sierra of 4.10 is definitely high for a member of our starting rotation. And the pitching matchup is definitely going to favor the Braves here in Game 1. 27-year-old Rod Perales on the mound for Atlanta. He tied with Santana for the National League lead with wins, 20-6 record, 3.21 ERA, 244 strikeouts over 224 1/3 innings. Looking at these seasons he's put up just the last 3 years of his career, a little surprising that there's no all-star hardware for Mr. Perales, but He's going to try to get a postseason victory. Can see the on paper, even though Atlanta was a 104 win team and we were a 97 win team, we had a better offense and a better pitching staff, and we won the season series against them. But the way that the cookie crumbled this year, we are still on the road, and they are the favorites, and they certainly have the favorable pitching matchup with our number 5 starter going up against their 20-game winner here in Game 1. And perhaps not surprisingly, the Braves got the 6-2 victory, hit a couple of homers off us, jumped out with 3 runs in the second, and then added more runs in the 5th, 6th, and 7th. We got runs driven in from center fielder Ramon Herrera and DH Alex Perkins for our 2 runs. In Gaona, it was a rough game. 5 earned runs over 5 1/3 innings, allowed 10 batters with 8 hits and 2 walks, only struck out 2. Maybe should not have had as much faith in our manager, but the decision has been made. If we are fortunate enough to win 3 of the next 4 games and move on to the NLCS, we'll put ourselves in a position where maybe I can overrule the manager and move the youngster into the rotation, but we've got a lot of work to do before that will become an issue. And we're also in a situation at this point where if we do get to a Game 5, Gaona would be back on the mound. So that is not necessarily a prospect that makes me feel real good right now. But we've got a lot of work to do to even get to a Game 5. We're going to have to take 2 of the next 3 games starting tomorrow, which will soon be today in Atlanta, where we're going to have the young ace Luis Longoria on the mound, going up against Robert Santana for Atlanta. Santana looks like a pretty solid veteran pitcher. Must have had some injury issues this year. Only pitched 10 games between AAA and the majors. He is fragile. 1-4 record with a 6.32 ERA, so did not perform well, but certainly looking at his ratings, looks like a pretty good pitcher. But that said, with Longoria on the mound in his electric stuff, this is a must-win for our Pirates. And we did not get the win in the must-win, so we are down 2-0 as we prepare to head back to Pittsburgh. So our backs are as up against the wall as they can be. We still have not hit a home run in this series. Franks has hit home runs in both games for Atlanta. Looking at the box score, it was kind of a pitcher's duel until the 6th inning, and then they erupted for 4 runs against us, and seems like that was all that she wrote. Isaiah Hill drove in 3 for us, also got ribbies for Gonzalez and Flores, but not enough to overcome that deficit. We got 2 runs in the top of the 9th, but they ended up closing the door on us. Longoria was not great, not horrible, but not great. 4 earned runs over 5 1/3 innings pitched, 7 hits allowed, 2 walks, did strike out 7. Looks like Tolka came on and probably allowed a run to score in relief of Longoria. Yeah, because they had 5 runs by the end of 6, so he allowed an inherited runner to score. Calvin also gave up a run, and then Jarmon pitched to 1 batter. Must have picked somebody off or something, because he got credit for a third of an inning, but he didn't throw a single pitch. Kind of a weird line there for Mr. Jarmon. But yeah, there was an inherited runner. Must have picked him off or caught stealing. So our backs are definitely up against the wall. We will have our 20-game winner, Tony Santana, on the mound in Game 3 when we do get back to Pittsburgh. But it's a tough situation for the Pirates now. We finally got past the New York Mets, and now we're trying to get past the team that beat them in their own division. 20-game winner Tony Santana on the mound for Pittsburgh, so we've got a guy that we should feel pretty comfortable with. He's going up against another Tony Ballesteros, 35-year-old, another guy who looks like a lot of injuries this year. Pitched just 9 games, 1-3 with a 5.79 ERA at the major league level. But extreme ground ball pitcher who still throws in the mid-90s with excellent movement on his pitches. The pitching matchup has to favor us, and especially with the fact that we're at home. But Tony Ballesteros certainly doesn't look like a bad pitcher. And we finally break through, though, in a 9-6 victory. Neither of the starters involved in a decision. Former Royal Mike McNeil with a home run for the Braves. Pittsburgh finally gets a home run from Alex Perkins, who was the National League Rookie of the Year back in 2041. Taking a look at the box score, scored early and often to jump out to a 4-0 lead. They closed it to 4-3, took a 5-3 lead, and then they tied it at 5, went into extra innings. Wow, they scored 1 in the 11th to take the lead on us. We came back with 4 runs in the bottom of the 11th to save the victory. Isaiah Hill 2 for 3 with a double and 2 walks, a couple of runs scored. The bottom of the 11th, Alex Perkins, not just the home run that we talked about, a grand slam walk-off home run against Luis Rayo. So can't get much better than a walk-off grand slam home run at home in the 11th inning. And you can see the win probabilities shifted very quickly in that bottom of the 11th inning. Ballesteros was not good for Atlanta. Santana was pretty mediocre for us. Montoya, the youngster, came in and blew the save for us, but got 3 innings out of Collazo to end up clinching the victory. So we will not be swept, and we are on to Game 4. Could be the final home game of the season for these Pirates. Would love to go out with a win, because that means we'll get one more shot in Atlanta, and maybe it won't end up being the final home game of the year. Bobby Gonzalez, the winner of the clinching Game 3 in the series against the Mets. Actually, I don't know if he got the W. I think, did he? Already forgotten. I've already moved on. He did not get the W. We did win the game, but he was not involved in the decision in Game 3 against the Mets. Rodolfo Morales, 34-year-old, on the mound for the Braves. 9-5 record with a 3.74 ERA over 118 innings pitched. Looks like a lot of the Braves' top starters were off and on the IL this season. They still managed to piece together a 104-win season, so not going to feel bad for them, particularly today in Pittsburgh, as we try to even up the series and send it back to Atlanta. But it is not to be. The Pirates season comes to an end in the National League Division Series. Final home game of the year. Final game of the year, lose 5-3. Bobby Gonzalez saddled with the loss. Luis Flores did hit a home run for us. Braves with 3 runs in the 5th proved to be the difference. Gonzalez, 3 runs, 2 of them are earned over 4 1/3 innings, 87 pitches in those 4 1/3 innings, walked 4 batters, just clearly not at his best. Tolka, not good in relief. After that, we did get scoreless relief from Calvan, Jarmon, and Collazo over the last 4 1/3 innings, but by then we were far enough behind, and although we did get a run in the 9th, it was not enough for us. Got a couple of runs batted in from Flores, including the home run. Also got runs batted in from Dixon. Actually, he's the only other one who had a run batted in, because we only scored 3 runs. So the 2043 season is over for our Pittsburgh Pirates. And I guess the Pirates should not feel too dispirited about our loss because the chalk held in all four of the division series. The teams with the byes, the Rangers, the Royals, the Cardinals, and the Braves all moved on to the League Championship Series. So the four best teams in baseball are the four teams left as we try to figure out who the 2043 World Champions will be. But before we find out who's going to be playing in the World Series, we'll take a look back at the season that was for the Pittsburgh Pirates. As we talked about, we were third in the league in runs scored and generally in the top 6 or 7 of pretty much every category in team batting. So top half of the league in offense and obviously top 20% of the league in runs scored. So a really improved offensive season for this Pirates team. Once again, the pitching was excellent. Third in starters ERA, second in bullpen ERA, second overall in runs allowed. You can see, except for walks, we were in the top 3 in every pitching category in the National League, led the league in strikeouts, and pretty good defense also. So that all added up to a 97-65 record. Second place finish in the division, second place in the wild card, but we were 6 games worse than some of those really good statistics suggested we should be. The weak month of August definitely set us back in our quest to potentially compete with the Cardinals for the NL Central, and may have ended up costing us in the playoffs. Who knows what would have happened if maybe we had home field advantage for the whole playoff run, but still a good year for a very small market Pirates team. You can see 27th in player payroll, 29th in budget. I think and I hope that after having our budget cut for this season, after making it to the NLCS, the fact that we did make more money this year, earning over $20 million, close to $21 million, as opposed to the little less than $9 million we made last year. Hopefully, that very profitable season, as well as reaching the playoffs, extending Bobby Gonzalez, and improving our attendance this season. If there's ever a year when we're going to get a bump, it should be this coming season. How much Mr. Nutting will give us remains to be determined. And obviously, we've talked a lot about our pitchers as we've previewed the different playoff series. No need to rehash all of that. Santana probably will be getting, along with Longoria, some Cy Young Award votes this year. And we did talk a little bit about Jose Montoya. Didn't end up using him in the rotation in the postseason, but the 25-year-old who went 7-5 with a 4.08 ERA figures to be an important member of our starting rotation going forward. The bullpen was really solid. You can see Manny Collazo, 2.30 ERA and 37 saves. Greg Gaylord, one of the higher ERAs at 3.81, but still struck out 74 batters in 54 1/3 innings pitched. Mario Tolka, really nice first season in Pittsburgh after we traded for him last offseason, 2.77 ERA. Ricky Rios, we talked about coming back from the injury. Nick Jarmone, a guy who was a Rule 5 acquisition a couple years ago and has become a pretty steady bullpen arm for us who can strike out some batters over the last few years. Elijah Helton is a guy who was once our closer not that long ago, and as our pitching staff has improved over the past several years, you can see he's gone from a guy who brought on before the trade deadline, saved 12 games for us as our closer in 2040, and these last 3 years has moved to more of a supporting role in the bullpen, but is not had an ERA above 2.92 for any of the past 3 seasons. So a very valuable arm for us. And Angel Calvan, we talked about him, picked him up in a trade right before the trade deadline, He pitched game 162 for us, lost 1-0, which ensured that the Mets would be hosting us in the NL wildcard series. Didn't end up mattering as we got past the Mets to face the Braves. He ended up putting up respectable numbers for us, 3.68 ERA over 36 2/3 innings. Most of these guys are going to be back next year, so the expectation is that we will have a pretty good pitching staff again in 2044. Turning to our everyday players, as I mentioned, the sum of the offense ended up being greater than the parts in my view. Starting with Ishmael Heel, a nice defensive catcher who looks like he has a brutal bat, but somehow hit 250 for us when he finally got his shot back in the majors this year after spending the past few seasons down in AAA. He was the backup to Nelson Ibarra, who we picked up in a trade with Texas last offseason. Hit 10 homers for us, but batted just .221. But quite honestly, with that glove, if we can just get a little more offensive production out of him, he's going to be a pretty useful player. Good news is that he's only got 2 years in the majors at this point, so he's still going to be on a minimum salary next season. So he will definitely be back as our starting catcher. Hopefully we can get a little more hitting out of him. Luis Flores ended up missing a good chunk of time in July, August into September. Still hit .310 for us in 287 at-bats. This was a Rule 5 acquisition from the Braves a couple years ago, who's turned out to be a pretty decent bat for us. Good personality in the clubhouse, guy who's been a pretty valuable player for us, and hopefully will be for several years to come. Alfredo Velasquez had a really nice season, a guy we picked up in a trade with the Phillies about 3 years ago. And he got more playing time than ever this past season and really responded with 34 homers and 100 runs driven in. Only batted .244, but still put up a 2.1 WAR. Nice season. Not the greatest defensive player in the world, but if he keeps hitting the way that he's hit for us, we'll let it slide. Juan Rivera, who we picked up in a trade with Seattle last offseason, ended up becoming our starting second baseman for the last little stretch of the season because of the injury to Serrano. Hit a respectable .257 for us. Like his defensive versatility, like his speed, he's a good bunter, pretty decent personality. He's durable, player who can play a lot of different positions. Thinks that he's going to have an important role for us going forward. His arbitration number for next year, not that bad at $1.1 million. Jaden Dixon, somewhat surprisingly, became our third baseman. Did not hit much, .236 batting average. He's a good defensive third baseman. The hope is that he becomes a utility infielder for us. His arbitration number next year is not that bad. In a perfect world, I think we'd like Ethan Fox to take over as third baseman. He did hit .286 for us, as we talked about earlier, when we decided to put him onto the playoff roster. Certainly think that both he and Montoya have big futures for us. Pretty hard to imagine that he's not going to be on the Major League roster next season. The bat doesn't look special, but he's got such good defensive versatility that hard to imagine that he won't be a regular player for us next year. Tony Cota, the excellent defensive shortstop, batted .249 for us this year. That was worse than last year in his first full season with the Pirates. But with that glove, if we can continue to get 150-plus games from this durable shortstop, and he hits anywhere, in the neighborhood of the .270 and .249 that he's hit for us these past 2 seasons, pretty valuable player. And he's also heading to arbitration for the first time. A lot of guys in that situation here, but the number of $1.8 million is not overwhelming. Nelson Torley is the guy that we picked up from the Dodgers. He did not hit much for us, .205 and 44 at-bats. Hard to imagine he'll be back next year. going to be a free agent, and a wrecked 30-year-old, even if he is pretty good defensively, is probably not someone that we're going to be spending a lot of money on, and I'm sure he's looking for a lot. Would love to bring him back because he is a fan favorite, but I would think that odds are we'll be moving on from Torley. Isaiah Hill, 5 seasons in the majors now, 5 All-Star awards, probably will get a 5th Silver Slugger. Big question is whether he might get a 3rd MVP award this year. 319 batting average, which I believe is the highest of his career. Yeah, he hit 300 each of his first 2 years, dipped into the 280s the last 2 years. So career high 319 batting average, 47 home runs, career high 140 runs driven in, and a 7.7 WAR, which is the highest since his Rookie of the Year / MVP 2039 season. Similar to Tony Santana, Isaiah Hill is the other guy that, despite our minuscule budget, we felt we needed to have on the team. Next year, $18 million is what would have been the last of his arbitration-eligible seasons, and that number is significantly less than the low 20s millions he was expected to make at the time we signed him. Honestly, with the way he's performed over his career, that arbitration number would probably be more in the mid-20s at this point. So he'll be back next year, but you can see when we get into the free agency years that we bought out, he's starting to get closer and closer to market value every year. At some point, we may have to trade him away. Would love it if our budget continues to expand so he can remain and maybe even someday retire as a member of the Pirates, but no guarantees that that's going to happen. Omar Vieira, minor league free agent signing we made last year, who ended up playing a utility outfielder role for us, or minor league free agent signing, a few years ago. He'd been in the minors the last few seasons. Somewhat surprisingly, made the 26-man roster out of spring training. Did mention that we have had to move on from a lot of players last year because of our salary constraints. So the now 35-year-old hit 360 for us. It was only in 50 at-bats, but was still very productive in the limited opportunities that he got. Center fielder Ramon Herrera, 252 batting average, but 31 homers and 107 runs driven in. Still a pretty decent defensive outfielder. Glad to have him around, and his salary is not much at all, so a very cost-effective player for us to have here in Pittsburgh. Alex Perkins, right fielder / DH at this point, was Rookie of the Year, as we mentioned, in 2041. A bit of a sophomore slump last year. Rebounded a little bit this year, I guess you could say. He only improved the batting average by 1 point, but did hit 5 more homers and drive in 33 more runs in very similar playing time. So his slugging percentage and his OPS were both higher, and a bit above average in terms of his OPS plus and WRC plus this year compared to his sophomore year when he was a bit below average in those numbers. He expected to make a little over $6 million in arbitration now that he's got 3 years in the majors. Given his batting profile and given the youth that we have in the majors now and or on the way, Perkins is a guy we may be needing to move on from sooner rather than later. And some of that youth is Henry Gonzalez, who in 2038, when we took over this team, we picked as the number 1 overall pick in the draft. He's viewed now as the number 19 prospect in baseball. I think that probably should be higher. His batting average did kind of dip a bit towards the end of the year, ended up hitting just 271, but finally developed some of the power that we had been desperately waiting for throughout his minor league career. 22 doubles, 5 triples, and 24 home runs and 454 at-bats. The OPS plus of 151, WRC plus of 153, both really impressive for a rookie. 4.8 WAR. I'm assuming was second on the team, yet behind Isaiah Hill. So would think that he would be an even stronger candidate for Rookie of the Year than we think Isaiah Hill may be for most valuable player when we get to that point. And if Gonzalez does end up winning Rookie of the Year, that will give us 4 Rookies of the Year in 5 seasons. Isaiah Hill won in 2039. As we talked about earlier, Alex Perkins won in 2041. Maybe Henry Gonzalez will win in 2043. And last year, as we talked about at the beginning of this episode, guy who ended up in the minors for much of this season was actually the National League Rookie of the Year back in 2042 in Sean Barley. So we've got talent on the team now, I think, in both our rotation and our everyday players. I still feel like it's going to be pretty difficult to build something incredibly sustainable unless we can get that player payroll up another $20 to $30 million. But given that we're 6 years into this playthrough and we haven't honestly made as much progress as I would have liked to with our budget and player payroll, I'm pretty pleased with how we've performed on the field. Obviously, the goal is to win championships, and we have not done that yet. But I like the talent on our team, and I see no reason why we're not going to be competitive for the next couple of seasons. And the 2043 World Series is going to be a rematch of the 1985 World Series 58 years later. The Battle of Missouri, with the Kansas City Royals taking on the St. Louis Cardinals. And this is a tough one for the Pirates to stomach. The Cardinals, the team that have beaten us in the NL Central each of the last 3 seasons, against the Royals, our former team. I don't think they've been back to the World Series since we left 6 years ago. But they still have a lot of familiar names. Still a great pitching staff in Kansas City, first in the NL in runs against, good offense, 5th in runs scored. Cardinals very well balanced, 3rd in runs against and 4th in runs scored. Shows you how disappointing our season really was, though, because we were better than the Cardinals in runs against, and we were better than the Cardinals in runs scored overall. But they ended up beating us by 6 games in the division, and now they are in the World Series. And we'll find out what happened shortly. And 6 years after we left Kansas City, our former squad wins another World Championship. Jonathan Ojeda, one of the guys that we had back in the day, has put together a brilliant career since we picked him at the end of the first round in 2034. He's a guy who made it up to the majors in very short order. I don't know why I'm looking at his fielding stats, but he was in the majors at 21 years old. You can see he led the league in homers a couple of times in the seasons, his first 4 seasons in Kansas City, perennial all-star at this point, won a couple of Silver Sluggers, won a couple of playoff MVP awards, or 3 of them at this point, and you can see he was with us for our 35 and 36 championships there, and now has added a 2043 Major League Championship. Another big guy for us back in the day was Javi Medina, who we had picked up in the Rule 5 draft back in 2034. Sucked it up and kept him on the Major League roster the whole year, and he actually hit pretty well, 287 with 20 homers, even though he theoretically wasn't really ready for it. And he's become a really good player for Kansas City, leading the league in ribbies a couple of times. A lot of the rest of the team looks like it's turned over at this point, which after 6 years away is not a total shock. Willie Cananya is a guy, was our number one draft pick back in 2033. Looks like he's been splitting time between Omaha and KC these past couple years, but that's another familiar name. The pitching staff, I think, is even a little more familiar. Although it looks like most of the veterans who were around when we were GM of the team are now gone. Javi Toledo was an international free agent signing of ours in 2035. Looks like he's been pretty solid for them, leading the league in ERA with a 2.57 ERA this year as a 24-year-old. I think Jose Carranza, yep, he was a number one pick of ours back in 2033, 29-year-old. Looks like he's become more of a bullpen arm for them than a starting pitcher, but a 3.26 ERA and 67 strikeouts over 49 and 2/3 innings. Tony Rivera, I want to say, is another guy. No, he came minor league free agent signing in 2038. Where did he come from? That name sounded familiar to me, but maybe he wasn't a guy that we had. No, that was after we were gone, so can't take credit for Mr. Rivera, although he does look like a pretty good pitcher. But good to see a couple of the guys that we picked in the first round years ago being useful contributors to the Royals team here. But also, with the exceptions of Ojeda and Medina, not really a lot of players left and healthy who were key contributors to the championship teams that we had at this point, closing in on a decade ago when we started that run of 3 consecutive World Series championships with the Royals. And now, what is sadly one of the most exciting days of the year as the general manager of the Pittsburgh Pirates, when we find out what our new budget is. Arbitration is starting, the off-season is beginning. Top prospects, does not look like there are any Pirates among the top 10 prospects in baseball at this point. Got some personnel that's moving on. Our contract has been extended by Mr. Nutting, but again, for just 1 year. He is so cheap. We keep outperforming with this team, and he only gives us 1-year deals. He does not want to make a long-term commitment. Retirement of our pitching coach in Indianapolis. Retirement of our team trainer, which is okay. He was going to be a free agent anyways, and he was kind of a 1-year stopgap. That'll give us another opportunity to hopefully bring on a better team trainer. Retire number 61. Oh, Neil Cruz was not a member of the Pirates while we were involved in the organization, but 354 home runs over the course of his career, so the Pirates going to announce the retirement of his number. Review of our season goals. As I said, it should be good. Got to the playoffs, re-signed Bobby Gonzalez. We're increasing our attendance. He's not upset with a playoff team, but he's still hoping for more. Delighted with our performance, but what he asks of us is not the only thing I'm evaluated on. He's happy with our performance, but would like to see more from the team. Big sigh. We've made the playoffs 4 of the last 5 years, Mr. Nutting, with at best the 27th payroll out of 30 teams. And you really want to see more from us. You should be thanking your lucky stars that I am willing to deal with your nonsense. I already had a Hall of Fame resume when I came here, with 5 world championships with the Kansas City Royals. The only reason I'm still putting up with your nonsense is that if I can somehow get a title with this low budget Pirates team and your penny pinching ways, that will turn me from a future Hall of Famer into a true legend of the game. And in my efforts to finally win a championship with these Pirates, more money would be a big help. How, if any way, will Mr. Nutting help us with that goal for the upcoming season? $142 million. So I think that's flat. That is really dispiriting. I kind of understood it last year when we only made $8.6 million despite going to the NLCS, that Mr. Cheap Bob Nutting actually took money out of our budget. But this year, being back in the playoffs for a third consecutive season, making almost $21 million, winning a playoff series, improving attendance, improving revenue per game, and he keeps our budget flat, lower than it somehow peaked at 2 years ago. Bob Nutting, you are the bane of my existence. And there is absolutely a part of me that wants to take my legendary reputation and my 16 playoff appearances and 5 World Series championships and .568 winning percentage, and look at what else is out there. Because, Mr. Nutting, you are destroying my soul. The A's look horrible. They're a small market, even worse fan interest than we have here in Pittsburgh. And they're willing to pay me more money for 4 years. They've got the lowest budget in baseball. Player payroll in the same horrible neighborhood that the Pirates are. Horrible attendance. Kind of surprised they haven't moved to Las Vegas yet, but maybe I have that turned off. It's been so long since I started this playthrough, I can't remember. They've got a pretty miserable farm system. And their owner's also, I can't believe John Fisher is still their owner. These penny pinchers are still both kicking in their early 80s with John Fisher and Bob Nutting. So there's part of me that wants to go to the A's just because I can't deal with Mr. Nutting anymore. There's a lot of horrible teams I could go to. I could go to the Cubs. Huge market. Paying me $2 sticks a year. 4-year deal. And I bet you I could turn that Cubs team around to be ahead of the Pirates as well as the Cardinals in not a lot of time. because even though they've stunk on the field with a 56-106 record, they've got $274 million to spend. A budget that's $30+ million more than we're spending. And that nice little $100 million to potentially bring on free agents. But I am nothing if not loyal. So although Mr. Nutting has hurt me deeply with his penny pinching payrolls for the last couple years, I'm not going to leave yet. We've still got a job to do. We've still got to get these Pirates into a World Series. And we've still got to win a World Series. But I do say this. If we win a World Series with these Pirates, and Old Man Nutting is still the owner, I am going to resign the day after we win that World Series and take a different job. And I know it might burnish my resume more if I could somehow be a multiple World Series winning champion GM dealing with Mr. Nutting. But at this point, I've about had it. But I like the direction of this team. But I was hoping we would have a lot more flexibility this coming off season. You can see the player payroll has spiked up a lot because our closer Manny Collazo is going to be looking for a $10 million raise. So guess what? Manny Collazo is not going to be on our team next year. Already talked about potentially moving on from Alex Perkins. Elijah Helton is making a lot at this point for a middle reliever. Victor Serrano, the injured second baseman, looking for a nice raise. And then Luis Longoria, the brilliant young pitcher, also looking for a big raise. Those are the key drivers of why this salary for this upcoming season is bumped so high and why it looks like we've got no money to spend. It's going to really stink to have to move on from Collazo, but a $10 million raise for a closer, as good as he is just not something we can afford to do. So Collazo is going to be gone next year. It's possible Alex Perkins is going to be gone next year. It's very possible Elijah Helton's going to be gone next year. It's very possible Victor Serrano is going to be gone next year. I'm hanging on to Longoria, even though that fragility scares the heck out of me. He is a special player with 624 strikeouts and 426 innings pitched and a 2.49 career SIERA. But potentially moving on from Collazo, Perkins, Helton, and Serrano combined, that's going to clear out over $30 million. Which will put our payroll back down into the mid-70s and actually maybe allow us to sign a player or two this offseason. And we're just going to ignore that we are creating a hole at second base. We're creating a big hole in the outfield. And then we're creating two massive holes in our bullpen by making those moves. but that's life. With Mr. Nutting, who wants us to get back into the playoffs again and wants us to upgrade at third base, even though that penny pinching weasel isn't giving us any extra money to do it. So we will be back in our next episode with our plan on how we're going to try to keep this thing moving in the right direction, despite the fact that it seems like our budget may have kind of topped out. You know, what we're going to have to focus on financially, I just hate playing the fan interest game. But quite honestly, boosting fan interest right now is the only way that we're going to be able to set higher ticket prices, the only way that we're going to be able to significantly improve our revenue, and hopefully, I don't know if we've got to make $40 million next year, but we've got to make some insane amount of money for Mr. Nutting to give him for him to give us the opportunity to play with a bigger budget. So honestly, with those players that are moving on and the little amount of money that I'm going to have to spend, I'm going to probably have to spend it on players who are popular, even if they're not as good as other players who could help us win, because we've proven we can win with the Pirates with 4 playoff appearances in the last 5 years. But we haven't proven, and actually we've proven we can get fans in the seats, because you look at where attendance was before we took over at 1.8 million, and we've been 2.8, 2.85, 2.7, 33,700 fans a game. We're less than 5,000 away from capacity, so we're getting enough fans in the seats. It's just that because of the small market size, the pathetic fan loyalty, and the very mediocre fan interest, we can't be charging $20, $25, $30 an average ticket price. And that's been a battle for us. And if you've been watching consistently, you know that we've been trying to fight this fan interest battle as often as possible. But I think we're going to have to be even more explicit and focused on it, because it does not appear that winning, going to the playoffs, going to an NLCS, having potentially 4 out of 5 rookies of the year, having one of 3 players in baseball history who won an MVP award and a Rookie of the Year award in the same season, having an incredibly dynamic young starting pitcher on your team. It doesn't seem like any of that stuff really gets the fans of Pittsburgh out. So the only lever that I know that we can press is to sign players who they view as popular, even if they stink, and putting them on our team. And hopefully we've got enough of the good players that I've traded for and drafted and scouted and developed over these past several seasons that we can afford to have a couple of popular guys who just aren't that good as, the 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th players on our roster. But the definition of insanity is repeating the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And clearly just building a really good baseball team is not what Mr. Nutting wants. He wants to make gobs of money. And the easiest lever that I can think to press to help him do that is to press that fan interest button as early and often as possible in this coming off season. So we will find out how that goes in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching and hope you have a great day.